It is stated in biology that life begins at conception.
This is not true, but I love when people say it because it's actually a really fun thing to explain.
Someone tagged me in this, probably hoping I would debunk this guy, but actually I think I agree with almost everything he says. Also, as an aside, I love his demeanor. He just explains his point. He's not condescending. He doesn't use unnecessarily technical language. It was a really good video.
The concept of life is literally just carbon-based matter that is able to replicate and expand.
Yeah, the word life is kind of vague, and there are lots of different concepts of life, and it's a good argument for pro-lifers to stop saying life begins at conception and maybe be more specific. Like I say, the individual human organism's life cycle begins with the zygote. Granted, that's a lot wordier.
In the studies that this guy is talking about, these scientists were asked if you had to decide when a new human life starts, where would you draw that line?
The guy at the beginning of this video didn't reference studies, he referenced embryology textbooks. And embryology textbooks aren't just talking about when life begins, they're talking about when an organism's life cycle begins. It could be the mammalian organism or it could be specifically a human organism, but they're all going to tell you the same thing. It's fertilization or conception or however you want to describe it. It's when you have a zygote. In terms of biology, this is not a confusing thing. It's not hotly debated. You go from haploid gametes undergoing meiosis to a diploid zygote undergoing mitosis. It's a clear demarcation. It's a paradigm shift.
Conception when new DNA is formed.
It's not just about new DNA forming, because you could have different combinations of DNA that you can create in lab settings for all kinds of things, and it doesn't mean you have a new life. You can also clone an animal and then they have the exact same DNA as their predecessor, and it doesn't mean they aren't a different organism. Of course, cloning aside, in the vast majority of cases, if you have a new organism through sexual reproduction, they're going to have different DNA than their parents. So when pro-lifers talk about how there's unique DNA at the moment of conception, it's really kind of a shorthand for saying we have an organism that is a different organism than the parent. It doesn't mean that DNA is all that matters, which is why when people point out that our skin cells have human DNA and we don't care when we scratch skin cells off our arm, yeah, we don't, because skin cells aren't a separate human organism.
That's like the starting point for the process of the creation of like a different separate human unit.
The zygote isn't the beginning of a separate human organism. It is already a separate human organism from the parents.
That doesn't mean that that sperm and egg that just came together is a person.
Yes. He's absolutely right about this. There's a difference between talking about the biological facts of reproduction versus the philosophical concept of personhood.
Which has been the pro-choice argument since forever.
It's one of the pro-choice arguments. It's definitely not the only one. I think more philosophically inclined pro-choice people think that when we talk about biological humanity, we are either strawmanning the pro-choice position or we ourselves can't tell the difference between biology and philosophy. And some of that is happening all the time. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. But when I talk about biological humanity, a lot of times it's in response to pro-choice people saying biologically, factually incorrect information. Most of this revolves around not knowing what an organism is. So that's why you'll get people accusing pro-lifers of thinking that if we eat unfertilized chicken eggs, we must be eating chickens, or saying that if we think abortion is murder, we must think that masturbation is genocide, or we must think that menstruation is manslaughter, or something like that. I've also had people tell me that neurons are organisms, or skin cells are organisms, or literally all cells are organisms. I've had people tell me that the embryology textbooks I share with them are religious propaganda.
And it definitely doesn't mean that science says that life begins at conception.
Biology says that zygotes are new organisms, though. That part's true. But he is right that if you say science says life begins at conception, that is not the whole debate. Especially if you mean life begins at conception to mean that a zygote or an embryo or a fetus is a valuable human child. That's a philosophical idea, and science can't speak to whether your philosophy is correct or not. Science can just give us facts on which to build our philosophies. So that means that science is important. We do have to talk about it. We do have to have a shared understanding of the biological facts of when the human life cycle is, things like that, which is why we do keep talking about it. But science isn't the end of the conversation. We have to have whole separate conversations about, okay, let's say we all recognize the biological humanity, you've got a new human organism. Now we have to have a whole separate conversation about whether that new human organism is a valuable child and why or why not.